All right, cool. Well, hey, Elias. Thanks so much for joining me today. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. My name's Elias Ayrey. I work at Pachama. We're a technology startup that's essentially trying to bring remote sensing technology to the carbon credit ecosystem. My background is in forest science and remote sensing. I have a PhD in forest science, and I graduated about a year ago, and I've been working for Pachama since.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to get started and learn about remote sensing in forests. So maybe to start us off, can you just give a brief overview on like what remote sensing actually is and what it's used for in a forest context?
Well, I mean, there are many, many different types of remote sensing out there, and generally, if anybody has asked any question about forests, somebody has come up with a remote sensing technique for trying to measure it. Uh, More broadly, it's generally, remote sensing just refers to making any measurements of the landscape using a remote sensor. So something like a satellite or an aircraft with a camera attached, or a drone, of course. And then some people even refer to it as from the ground if you have some sort of sensor too. Um, More generally, what remote sensing is used for at a global scale is often land cover, land use mapping. So that's essentially entails mapping the globe's land cover, determining what forest type you're looking at, or determining if you're looking at agriculture or urban areas. And people have been doing this since the 1980s. So this is kind of a well trodden upon topic. Likewise, forest cover is a very popular use of remote sensing. So that essentially entails analyzing a forest's ecosystem with a satellite and determining if it's being covered by forest or not, or what percent it is. Again, this has been around for at least the last 20 years at a global level. So it's kind of well accepted at this point. And then a little bit more recently, a lot of people have been using remote sensing techniques to derive like full forest inventories. And so just about everything you'd want to measure in a forest, how many trees are there, what size trees are there, how much carbon is there, what type of trees are there. People are basically answering those questions using remote sensing. At maybe a little bit less common, but still very, very common on the global level are productivity mapping. So people often will map out the productivity of a forest or even agricultural sites or a whole landscape to basically assess, how much carbon they can pull down per year. This is a good assessment of, how productive the site is for agriculture and stuff like that. And then fire risk is, depending on where you are in the world, if you're in California, fire risk with remote sensing is a pretty big deal. This is the primary driver behind people paying millions of dollars for remote sensing data to determine how much fuel load exists on the landscape. Um, but yeah, like I said, there are 1,000 shades of niche. There are people who are trying to determine how many dead stumps there are on the ground using, remote sensing techniques from aircraft. So
Awesome. Great. So, I mean, I definitely want to dive in a little bit more to a lot of those different use cases that you talked about, but maybe to get started, like, can you talk more about what tools are used and like how that remote sensing is actually done and sort of what what remote sensing and forest people like have at their disposal to do all of this?
yeah, so generally there are three different scales of remote sensing. You can think of it at like kind of a drone based level, which is an aircraft, but it still has to be launched from the ground, and so there still requires some driving out to the site to launch a drone. You get very high quality data from a drone, but it's very fixed in a certain area. There's aircraft, which are expensive to fly, but you can put all kinds of juicy remote sensing technologies on those aircraft. And then there's spacecraft. Um, and so when there are different groups who have different interests in different remote sensing products, and so at a national and international level, folks like NASA, folks like the folks arranging the Paris Agreement, they're really interested in space-based products that can develop remote sensing maps of entire countries or entire continents. And so in order to do that, there's a number of space-based initiatives out there. optical remote sensing is the most common. There's a satellite in particular called Landsat that's been in orbit since 1984. It's basically an imaging satellite that can more or less tell you what the color of the trees are, plus a couple of colors that we can't actually see. And this is useful for definitely deriving these like continental level maps. And we can I think we can talk more about space-based stuff in like a little bit later in the meeting. If we want to actually get down into accuracies that you can manage a particular forest for, the space-based stuff is great for describing entire continents. But if we actually then start looking at a specific plot of forest, the accuracy isn't so great because the resolution isn't so great, and you're not really measuring as much as you could be from an aircraft. And so if we're talking about actual forest inventories that can be used to make management decisions about the forest, then we're talking about airborne data. A lot of timber companies these days, the whole industry is kind of moving towards technology called LiDAR. It's a three-dimensional imaging technology that can more or less create kind of these three-dimensional point clouds that are renderings of the forest and the forest's trees and whatnot. And then we can analyze these point clouds and essentially describe almost everything you'd want to know about the forest using those point clouds. And then, drones are increasingly being used they're still kind of like experimental, but they're increasingly being used for very small sites. So it depends on what your management goal is. If you're drafting an international agreement, then you're looking for something that can be applied to the entire continent, but not necessarily accurate. But generally, the kind of work that I'm doing, we're trying to develop these carbon inventories at an accuracy that is appropriate for forest management on small areas. And so for the actual technologies involved in that, like I said, at a global level, there's a couple of technologies to kind of choose from right now. Right now, we've got Landsat, and this is where most of our forest products are actually derived. So the canopy cover maps that are out there, land cover, land use maps, even some carbon maps are derived mostly using Landsat. There are other satellites out there as well. There's a satellite called JEDI that was launched very recently, and it's basically a sampling satellite that measures tree height across large areas. And this is very useful for describing how much carbon there is in those large areas. It's not as useful for describing how much carbon there is in a small area, but it is going to get us very accurate estimates of a country's carbon stock, for example. Like I said, at the airborne level, it's mostly LiDAR that people are making use of to estimate forest carbon or other forest inventory metrics. Every major every major timber company, for example, generally has a LiDAR program at this point in which they're flying their landscape with LiDAR and developing things like merchantable volume that can then be used to make decisions.
Great. Well, it sounds like LiDAR is important. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of, what exactly it is, what the point clouds are, how that data is analyzed and collected, and why we don't use more of it?
Well, so to start, LiDAR is very expensive. Because it's affixed to an aircraft, we basically have to fly the aircraft very low and very slow with high degree of overlap. LiDAR acquisitions can get up into the millions quite easily. So as a result, what we see is, we've got these timber companies that have LiDAR over their landscapes. We've got LiDAR over many developed countries, but the developing world really doesn't have access to any LiDAR. What LiDAR actually consists of is, like I said, these three-dimensional renderings of the forest landscape. And this is what you kind of picture almost in like a video game. It's like a three-dimensional image. Instead of having solid objects, what we get are points. And each point represents basically a laser is shot down from an aircraft. It hits an object, a tree, for example, and it bounces back. And each point represents a return of the laser back to the machine. And so we get these beautiful three-dimensional renderings. The challenge then is actually describing what the forest, is from that data. And a number of people have done that. Mostly people turn to height. So people will use LiDAR to describe the height of trees off of the ground. And this can get you pretty far towards actually estimating biomass. Pachama has some like extra cool techniques that are basically scanning the LiDAR point cloud with like an AI algorithm It's very similar to self-driving cars. They also have LiDAR that they shoot out into the surroundings, and then they have some sort of algorithm that's detecting objects in their surroundings to make decisions about the car. Like I said, LiDAR tends to be too expensive. So the primary limitation of LiDAR is that it's often not feasible for a small area. So, when a company or when a state flies it, they're flying massive areas. It's not feasible to fly frequently. So people are only acquiring it once or maybe once every 10 years or something, and then updating later. And so at the very least, we need technologies that can fill in those gaps in time. But really what we need to do is get away from LiDAR as the end-all technique for measuring forest carbon stock and everything else you want to know about the forest. And so that's where a lot of Pachama's current research is headed. And I think that's where a lot of people are trying to improve upon the system right now.
What might those improvements look like? How would LiDAR get replaced? What's sort of the latest there?
Yeah, so one encouraging approach is photogrammetry, and this basically entails the three-dimensional reconstruction of a scene using a set of 2D images. And you've probably seen some sort of like 3D modeling that's derived from photogrammetry, even from the ground. There's a couple of cool like techniques you can use your smartphone to like create a 3D image of your face or something. Basically what happens is either from space or from an aircraft, we're taking a series of 2D images and they overlap, and the overlap between the two allows us to use some basic trigonometry to estimate the distance of those objects. And so very similar to LiDAR, we can kind of create these three-dimensional surfaces. More recently, we've seen some technology companies like Planet and Maxar launching massive numbers of satellites that can take very high resolution images of the Earth with this overlap. I don't think anyone has necessarily cracked the nut that to actually take those images and develop carbon maps or forest inventories with the same accuracy of LiDAR. This is something we're trying to do. But I think that's one of the parts of this field that excites me the most is we could potentially, they offer a global solution and at a lower price of LiDAR. We don't have to be flying airplanes around thousands of miles. There's some other technologies out there that are really exciting for folks like me. Another one is the European Space Agency is going to be launching a satellite called Biomass in a year or two, basically. And this is a radar satellite. So we haven't talked about radar at all, mostly because radar is relatively difficult to use to actually estimate forest biomass. But there are different types of radar. You can shoot a radar radio wave at different frequencies. And for the first time, the European Space Agency is going to be launching this satellite called Biomass with a frequency that's going to be relevant to actually estimating forest biomass. So this is exciting. That's going to be globally available, and potentially it could replace LiDAR for a lot of stuff. And then, another kind of cool satellite that's on the horizon is CO3D. It's a French National Space Agency constellation, very similar to what Planet has to offer today, potentially more publicly available. So we'll see if any of these can actually replace LiDAR.
Sounds pretty cool. An exciting future lies ahead.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious, and we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but can you talk a little bit more about the painting that's behind you?
Yeah, so this is a LiDAR height map, and this is what we actually use to analyze the forest. We create these three-dimensional renderings of LiDAR, and from that we can infer tree height and map that across space. And so what the painting is showing, the warm colors actually represent taller trees. And so what we would do to actually estimate biomass is potentially probably segment this up into little regions, little chunks. And then we would run that through some sort of statistical model to estimate biomass given the height of what we see in those chunks. And then we create estimates of biomass. Sorry, I do use biomass and carbon fairly interchangeably. They are very closely related to one another, and generally people are measuring one or the other. We have equations that can go between the two. So.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's very aesthetically pleasing. I'm really.
Yeah, it's all very aesthetically pleasing. It's really cool to be working in this field. Yeah, so at Pachama, what we're trying to do is basically what we're trying to do is bring all these techniques to the carbon market. You know, we're working in a marketplace that was developed fundamentally in the 1990s. The Kyoto Protocol, I don't know, what was it, 1998 or something, is where most of these carbon offset protocols come from. And so most of the modern protocol bodies that are issuing carbon credits more or less copy pasted a lot of their stuff from the Kyoto Protocol. So we see a lot of like, you know, bring over. And there hasn't been widespread adoption of, you know, the most modern remote sensing techniques. If the timber industry can use LiDAR to estimate how much, you know, merchantable volume they have and make billion-dollar decisions based on that, the carbon industry should certainly be able to do the same. Of course, we have to develop a whole suite of remote sensing techniques to actually make estimates that are relevant to a forest carbon project. There are a lot of different aspects of forest carbon projects beyond just how much carbon is there in the forest. We have to kind of address questions of, you know, additionality, which is kind of the justification of the project. And so this refers to like what would have happened if the project didn't exist. And for that, we're kind of looking at what's happened on the project in the past and we're kind of projecting what would have happened in the future. We're of course estimating how much carbon there actually is on the project, and then we're also constantly monitoring the project on a high frequency basis. And so each of those calls for actually different remote sensing techniques. You know, for high frequency monitoring, we don't necessarily need even a carbon estimate. We just need to know if there's forest or if there's not, or if there's been a disturbance. And so for that, we can use satellites that are maybe cheaper or free and acquire data on, you know, a weekly basis or something like that. So that's essentially what we do. There's a bunch of different technologies out there that are completely effective at estimating forest canopy cover. So we use radar. We use Sentinel-1 radar data from the European Space Agency. You know, there are folks who are using planet data. There are folks who are using basically this low resolution Landsat data. And they're all equally effective, more or less, at determining whether or not something is forest. That's one of the easier things in our field to actually distinguish. The harder stuff comes when you're actually trying to estimate, you know, real numbers, put real numbers to like how much carbon is there, how much carbon was, you know, if there was some sort of like degradation of the forest or a partial harvest, how much carbon was lost. These are the more challenging things that require commercial imagery or kind of trickier modeling.
Cool. So, I mean, I think that's a good transition from what you just said there to thinking about how forest remote sensing ties into carbon markets and sort of the interplay there. So can you maybe like just give an overview of like how remote sensing can help build carbon markets, or what the relationship is there and why it's so important?
Yeah, so currently, well, I think we need some context as to like how it's done right now. Right now, carbon markets are run more or less on field inventories. So if you want to register your forest and receive carbon credits for that, you have to undergo a set of very rigorous field work in which you send field crews out to measure trees within subsections of the forest. And this is tremendously expensive. If you want to continue in the program every 5 years or maybe a little bit more, you have to resend those field crews to remeasure those projects. As a result, forest carbon projects have been, well, it's very difficult to enroll in these programs. There's been a couple of studies in the United States, for example, that demonstrate that you need thousands of acres of land before it becomes financially viable. And that's just getting to the break-even point. That's not even considering like outcompeting timber as a as a management option. And so we really need to bring that cost down. And the number one cost being field inventories. The best way to do that is to eliminate the field inventories using remote sensing. And so what Pachama is trying to do is, part of what we're doing is basically taking established techniques that have been used by the timber industry for at least 10 years now to make these decisions and bringing them to the carbon market. Like I said, one of the things that we're trying to do is replace field inventories with LiDAR inventories. I think it's been demonstrated that you can develop LiDAR models that are pretty much as accurate as field inventories. They're also nice because you can map the entire region, right? Like you don't just have to focus on the little project. You can create these explicit maps of the whole area. You can map the entire project, make sure that you're not missing anything that was missed by a field crew. It's still fairly expensive. So one of Pachama's major goals for research is to replace LiDAR, like I said. We think the best bet of doing that is with some sort of stereo imagery, in which, you know, we're acquiring imagery from probably Planet or Maxar that can, you know, reconstruct height and develop carbon estimates from that. The other aspects that we're trying to replace, like I said, we're trying to replace kind of this this concept of justification of the project, what would have happened on the project. And so, you know, whereas today we've kind of got field inventories that are simulated out in time using kind of basically simulations of commercial harvests. They don't tend to be very accurate of the reality. There's been some pushback from people about, you know, how unrealistic these simulations are. We think that if we actually look at the data of the project's surroundings, we can say what would have happened on the project with a much more, you know, with driven by actual data instead of hypothetical scenarios. And so, you know, between the two, we think by driving the price down substantially, reducing the need for these field inventories, we can unlock carbon markets for millions of people. There are 5 million landowners, small landowners in the United States alone, who could be taking, you know, advantage of forest carbon projects. And yet, worldwide, across the entire planet, we see less than 500 forest carbon projects in existence today. And that's just a function of how difficult it is to enroll in these programs. It takes years to actually undergo these inventories and get the checks and double checks needed. And it's tremendously expensive. It takes tens of thousands of dollars, even if you own a very small amount of land. And so we desperately need to unlock this. We need to democratize the process somehow, because 500 carbon projects is not stopping climate change at all. It's not even making a dent. So that's where we're headed. I hope that you know, we can unlock this market for a lot of people.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm curious, like, what does the better world look like? Like, take me through. I'm a small landowner, or a small forest owner, I guess, and you know, I want to enroll in one of these programs and begin like a forest carbon project. In a world where remote sensing can be used and the process is improved, what does that process look like for them, and sort of how do they go towards enrolling and protecting their forest and enrolling in the project?
Yeah, the most ideal world that we're working towards is a world in which, well, more or less you can sign up via a website, and we can apply our algorithm for a low cost, hopefully using Planet data or something, estimate how much forest carbon you have today, how much you would have had without, you know, without any carbon incentives, and then start crediting you the difference. And this would be like a one-day sign up. All of the information would be taken care of, you know, on our end. We wouldn't have to send field crews. Potentially the only thing that we would need from a landowner in a developed nation is a deed certifying that they own the land and that and then you'd be entering into a contract for some duration to more or less say that you're going to retain this much carbon on your property, and just don't cut the trees. We'll be monitoring. That'll be part of the contract. We'll be monitoring on at least a monthly basis to make sure that you haven't cut the trees in an illicit way. But otherwise, we want to make it just that easy. And we even envision a scenario where, you know, Pachama could act as a Zillow type platform in which, you know, if you zoom into Zillow, you can get the estimates of what any particular lot of land is worth. There's no reason we couldn't work up to the point where we're doing that with forest carbon. We could assess how many carbon credits you could get by protecting your forest. And I think this would be a strong financial incentive for a lot of people who don't even know that forest conservation is an option for them. So I think that's where we're kind of working towards.
Cool. So to what extent is remote sensing already used in doing verifying for carbon markets? Is it a big part of it today, or is it just getting built up? Or
It's a very small part of it today. Like I said, the markets are kind of dinosaurs, and they're all based on these like protocols developed in the early 2000s or the 90s. There are many different protocols out there, right? There are different types of carbon projects, and there are different protocols for different parts of the world. Some of these protocols do allow some basic remote sensing. So forest cover loss often plays a key role in avoided deforestation projects. Land use, land cover change likewise plays a big role in avoided deforestation projects. The juicier technologies that I'm talking about that can get really accurate estimates of carbon aren't really accepted by any of these major protocols yet, despite the fact that they're widely accepted by the industry, the forest industry.
When will they be accepted by them? Like, are we moving towards that, or?
Everybody agrees that we need to be moving towards that. And this is one of Pachama's major goals in the next, at least probably 6 months, is to propose protocols to these bodies that will make use of remote sensing technology, or at least allow it. You know, we at least want it to be an option. So specifically, we want LiDAR to be an option for developing these inventories. I should say some of the larger avoided deforestation projects, a couple of them are entirely remote sensing based. They're not doing it necessarily in the way that we want them to, because they're kind of using these crude techniques to basically just measure land cover use change or forest cover and issuing credits based on that, rather than genuine estimates like this of how much carbon there is. Imagine, for example, if I estimated that the entire forest here had one value of carbon associated with it, and then I just used a map to map out areas where people had harvested. If they had harvested in these red areas, then they're obviously harvesting a lot more carbon than they are in those blue areas. So we'd really like something that's more precise, and I think we're working towards that. Everyone that we talk to in the protocol bodies is very excited about it, but they're also very cautious people. And to be perfectly honest, the remote sensing field is, you know, in the past, there have been a lot of people who overpromise. And I can point you to a lot of papers, remote sensing papers, that, you know, make maps that aren't any good, or have done studies that don't work. I can point you to people in the timber industry who have paid a lot of money for remote sensing data that they then, you know, find is not accurate enough to actually make management decisions about. So this is a challenge that we face, is we need to not only apply this technology for the first time, we need to convince the existing industry that we could come up with a set of standards that are reasonable to actually make decisions based on, and this can be verifiable by third parties. So.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that seems like a really important goal to push for. Can you give maybe, like, just to put this all into context, like a particular example of how Pachama is using remote sensing on like a given project, sort of, you know, soup to nuts, where you're starting and how you're going through the project, and ultimately like what the end goals are?
Yeah, so most of the time when we analyze a project, we're doing so using a kind of a coarse resolution biomass model. We're acting as a broker now. We're kind of accepting projects that already exist. And this is a biomass model developed using the spaceborne satellite Landsat that I talked about before, which is kind of a low resolution estimate of you know, a low resolution image of the Earth. The nice thing about that is that it's a satellite that, you know, they've been imaging the Earth every month since 1984. And so we can infer a lot of data about the justification of the project, about what's happening around the project, about what's happened in the project prior to its start date. An example for example, if we're looking at a reforestation effort, we want to make sure that there wasn't forest there to begin with, that they cut down and have since replanted trees. And if you can name it, we've caught a carbon project out on it. Unfortunately, we flat out reject about 30% of the projects that we come across, and another percentage of them are kind of marginal. There's a lot of room for improvement in the industry, and I think that one of the things that remote sensing can do is really illustrate that for people. So that was an example of a reforestation project that, you know, we don't think is necessarily well justified if they're harvesting native rainforest and replacing that with trees that they just planted. In an avoided deforestation context, we've seen people claim credits for projects that are in the middle of untouched Amazon, 50 kilometers of no deforestation, and they claim that it would have been 100% deforested over the next 10 years. What we also often see are people claiming credits for, and basically claiming that 100% deforestation would have happened. Now, in some cases in the Amazon, this is possible, or in the tropics, this is possible. In most cases, we're talking about over the course of 50 years, maybe something like 30% of the area would have likely been chipped away slowly by encroachment of families. And so we're looking at the rate that we can observe of deforestation and comparing that to the rate that the project proposes would have happened and seeing that that actually fits. And then finally, in an improved forest management scheme, one thing that we're often looking for, again, is like the baseline. So they have to create these simulations of what would have happened on the project. We want to make sure that the simulations match the actual landscape. We've come across projects, and there's even been an article recently about some stinkers out there. We've come across projects that are, taking place on land that's been preserved for 100 years, and the surroundings are not heavily deforested, and yet the project claims that it would have been completely clear cut in the next 10 years or something like that. So we want to make sure that these are realistic scenarios that people are proposing so that people aren't overcredited. We see other kind of manipulations of the system as well. We see gerrymandering, which is kind of a very United States term, but basically it involves drawing your project around areas in which you couldn't otherwise harvest trees. This is primarily, we see these gerrymandering projects when they're coming from timber companies. They go out and they harvest as many trees as they can, but trees that are stuck in ravines, trees that are stuck on small islands, trees that are stuck like right next to housing developments, then they enroll those for carbon projects. And they claim that they would have harvested them, even though they really can't. So these are this is the kind of value add that Pachama is bringing right now to the market. We are working on a protocol of our own. Like I said, we're gonna start proposing small modifications to existing protocols to include bits of remote sensing in them. But we're working on an entirely new protocol of our own that we hope will be kind of free of these examples of kind of bad things. And remote sensing has the capability of going far beyond field inventories in that we're able to look at directly look at the past and make inferences about the area that couldn't be otherwise made from a single observation in the forest at a single date.
That's amazing. When can we expect to see the new protocol?
Like I said, we're going to be rolling out bits of the protocol and proposing them to bodies. We think that it's more likely that the existing players in the field are going to be more accepting of little bits of it. So if we can say we're going to take a really accurate remote sensing LiDAR model and use it to estimate current biomass, that's going to be something a lot of people are going to accept over a protocol that's just 100% new and different. So we'll see when the whole thing gets rolled out, but we can expect a proposal for pieces of it, in the next month or two.
Wow.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, continue.
Oh, no, yeah.
All right. So then I want to take a step back again and go back more to the technology and sort of the process involved. So, I mean, obviously for carbon projects, one of the most important things is actually estimating the carbon stocks in the forest using remote sensing.
Yeah.
And I know for a forest, like, there's carbon above ground in the woody biomass, there's carbon below ground in the soils, and, maybe there are other factors that I'm not even thinking about. So can you talk more about like what's actually involved in measuring the carbon stock in a forest and like, how you translate the data into values for how much carbon is there and sort of what that whole process looks like?
Yeah, there are a number of carbon pools, which basically refers to where the carbon is stored. So above ground carbon, it just refers to carbon that's stored in the trees. And below ground carbon, it can refer to soil, but it often just refers to the roots. So when you read a carbon project and they talk about below carbon, they talk about the roots. Now, nobody's actually measuring the roots. What they measure is the trees above, and they have a relationship that links the amount of, the size of the tree above to the amount of roots below. So Pachama is making, and remote sensing in general can make estimates of the amount of carbon above and below ground in roots fairly accurately because we're essentially measuring the trees. We're looking at how high the trees are and the greenness of the trees and relating that back. Soil carbon is a much more difficult thing to crack. Most carbon projects today don't even bother because a soil carbon project involves digging ditches right now with field work, which is very difficult. And so there aren't that many projects that incorporate this. It's an option in all of these protocols, but nobody wants to dig these ditches for a couple extra tons of carbon. And with remote sensing, because the forest covers over the soil, it's a challenging thing to do. There are a couple of people who have taken stabs at it. They're kind of more inference than actual measurement. So you can kind of say that, like, based on the mountains, we think that the carbon's going to pool a lot here. We don't feel comfortable necessarily measuring soil carbon right now, nor do we feel comfortable measuring some of these smaller pools like dead wood. So people, part of an inventory is often measuring dead trees and trees that are laying on the ground. But honestly, what we see in the field is a tremendous amount of attention that's paid to really small bits, right? So some of these protocols go into great detail about, oh, you have to measure the dead trees with this level of accuracy, and you have to mark down exactly like this, and this from those trees. When in reality, we're talking about like 5% of the carbon on the landscape. And so if we just don't count it, okay, it's 5% less credits, but you're also laying out so much less work. So, we often draw the comparison, like current technologies are really focused on like counting every ant in the field and missing the elephants. If your carbon project is gerrymandered, then it doesn't matter if you've like actually just measured the dead trees. So we're focused on the biggest carbon pools right now. Maybe at some point we'll examine technologies for measuring dead trees, but it's a tougher thing to do.
And for measuring those big carbon pools, so you talked about LiDAR being used in measuring sort of the height and the color of the trees. And then how do you sort of go from that data to actually knowing how much carbon is in the forest?
So there are different levels of accuracy that we're looking for, like I said. So at a continental level, you don't need very good accuracy for a particular area. If you want accuracy that's on par with a field inventory, offers you basically the same statistical power as a field inventory, we are talking about LiDAR. And what we're essentially, we have these 3-dimensional point clouds. We convert them often to kind of 2-dimensional images representing different layers of the forest, kind of similar to an MRI in that we're converting 3-dimensional data into like very dense 2-dimensional data. And then we analyze that with, artificial intelligence techniques, statistical techniques, depends on who's doing it. Basically analyze this image and make estimates of forest carbon over this image. This describes how we do it with LiDAR under the ideal circumstances. The reality is that most people don't have access to LiDAR. When they do have access to LiDAR, it's like a couple years old. And so when we do it for free using Landsat data and map it through time, we're essentially looking at the color of the forest. Now we look at a couple different aspects of the color. It's not just what the human eye sees. We're looking at infrared bands as well. And because chlorophyll absorbs red light really well, because that's how photosynthesis works. It absorbs light and creates sugar. And it does not absorb infrared light well at all. We can look at the ratio between the two and get an estimate of how much chlorophyll exists on the landscape. Now, that doesn't necessarily tie back to how much carbon there is, but it does tell us, fairly well how much photosynthesis is taking place. And so we can kind of make that correlation and then make that jump to carbon at a coarser level, but at with less accuracy, but more temporal availability. We include all kinds of juicy extras into our models, and a lot of other people are starting to do the same. We want to know, for example, when the forest was last disturbed. So if we have a map that measures forest disturbance over the landscape, and it points out in this blue area that the forest was disturbed 10 years ago, well, obviously that's an important estimate of how much biomass there is today. If the forest was cut down 10 years ago, there's going to be less. And so we include this data in our estimates of biomass as well. And then we also include other environmental metrics. So we want to know how much precipitation, what is the slope, and all of these are kind of useful for estimating how much biomass there is. Collectively, all of these are kind of free techniques that are kind of alternative to LiDAR. We don't think they're quite accurate enough to actually verify how much carbon there is today and issue credits based on that. But we do think they're accurate enough to kind of justify a project and to kind of say what's been happening and what will happen in the future. And if you combine the two techniques like we were trying to do in our protocol, we think that we're going to have information that's more accurate and more informative than the current approaches to estimating carbon.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
it sounds like a really cool process, and it's amazing that it works. But yeah, no, I'm just impressed. But I also want to ask about, so, you mentioned before that LiDAR often isn't available in the developing world, and just because of how expensive it is. But how do like the number or the quality or even the existence of forest carbon projects in the developing world compare to what we have in the United States, for example?
Projects that we see in the developing world are usually much larger, and they're usually these avoided deforestation projects. And so they take place on areas that are sometimes the size of small, like Delaware, small U.S. states or small countries. But they are these avoided deforestation projects. To be clear, an avoided deforestation project is, avoiding loss. It's not necessarily drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And it's kind of these different questions. In terms of raw numbers, I mean, there are a lot of small projects in the United States and Canada right now. But they are usually like 2,000 a little bit more, like a couple thousand hectares relative to like these massive projects that are taking place in Peru or to the developing world. In terms of reforestation, we usually see those in the developing world, but it is a little bit of a mixture. I think, personally, I think there's room almost anywhere in the world for forests to grow. And so there's a lot of like desire for, to protect the Amazon and whatnot. And this is good. I mean, it's really important. But at the same time, you can sequester the same carbon from Canada or something. There's a lot of degraded forests out there across the entire world. So.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Sounds like there's a lot of room to grow. Can you also talk about how forests and forest remote sensing ties into REDD+? I know that's a big deal in the forest world, and also I know they have these like safeguards for environmental concerns that or other concerns like indigenous rights that are sort of not directly tied to the carbon. So what's the role of remote sensing in all of that?
Yeah, so we often say that, remote sensing can answer the big core questions about carbon projects, and we're trying to do that right now. Some of the secondary questions that are often just as important, like biodiversity and community co-benefits, are much trickier things to answer with remote sensing. Biodiversity, there's a couple of solutions out there that nobody's really fleshed out fully. Community co-benefits are almost impossible to measure with the satellite, right? Unless you can like directly observe a school being built or something like that. We just have to acknowledge that. So REDD+ projects, they operate with these massive kind of field campaigns in which they're tracking the money through the communities, and they're often surveying the communities and providing these training programs to the communities. And that's probably not something that's going away with the advent of remote sensing. Remote sensing does play a crucial role for REDD+ projects. They are the projects that most often use it because they're usually these avoided deforestation projects that are more or less mapping forest cover change. And so remote sensing is often used to basically establish what deforestation is in a reference area outside the project, to kind of establish what would have happened inside the project. And it is often used to kind of monitor the project and quantify it into the future. We think there's room for improvement because there's a bunch of different cool remote sensing technologies that can get you more accurate estimates, but it is most adopted by REDD+ projects right now. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, no, totally. And also, you mentioned at the very beginning that you had more to say about space-based remote sensing and space-based maps. So what's the latest there, and how are you thinking about space-based remote sensing?
Yeah, so I mean, traditionally, space-based remote sensing, it offers less accuracy than airborne stuff, right? But all of our maps of like historical carbon are based on these satellite imageries that are kind of lower resolution. There's a couple of satellites that are in orbit that are in widespread use today. So Landsat is one of them that I've been talking about. It's this very low resolution. It's like, the size of, it's a 30-meter image. So we're talking about 90 feet by 90 feet for a single pixel. Sentinel-2 is another satellite that's in orbit. It's just a higher resolution version of Landsat. Likewise, there's space-based radar that it's really good at describing forest canopy cover loss, but not as good at describing biomass. And so traditionally, space-based stuff has been used to kind of map these really large areas and RED Plus projects included, but not necessarily give you really precise estimates of carbon. And where I think the industry is headed, and where I get really excited, is that we're starting to see space-based techniques that can potentially replace airborne techniques. Like I said, we're starting to see like these high-resolution images that are taken from multiple angles that you can actually infer height from, and then develop carbon maps that are much more accurate than just looking at the color of the trees. So I'm optimistic that space-based is we're going to replace these airplanes that are flying around and polluting the air with tons of carbon themselves fairly soon with stereo data or whatnot. Those are the big space initiatives. So we've got like high resolution imagery that is taken from multiple angles. We've got low resolution imagery that we can use kind of generally to make these widespread inferences that Pachama is using a lot. We've got kind of then like radar-based data that can be used just to look at forest cover loss on a high-frequency basis. The nice thing about radar is clouds don't block them. So in the rainy season of the Amazon, for example, we don't have to worry about that. And then we do have spaceborne LiDAR, but that's more of a sampling. It doesn't create these three-dimensional renderings. It's basically just a shot down to the earth that measures tree height within like a 20-meter area. And that's going to be very useful for estimating tree height across large areas and estimating carbon across large areas. Again, if we're talking about a project that's like 2,000 hectares or like a small farmer or something, there's just not going to be any shots that land within his farm. So we still need some sort of alternative that can take that and create a map for this guy. Part of what Pachama is doing right now is we've got a lot of research on space-based techniques. Kind of like novel ones that are, haven't quite been demonstrated to get where we need to, but we think might have promise. And part of what we're doing is kind of trying to fuse all these technologies together. So we're, like I said, with the Landsat, we're already fusing a couple of technologies. Like we're fusing like precipitation maps, we're fusing historical deforestation maps, we're fusing, these low resolution images of color, near infrared and red, green, blue. And we'd like to also start, fusing together this JEDI data that will kind of infer tree height within very coarse like areas, and together potentially maybe they could get to the same level of accuracy that we can get from LiDAR. So hopefully we can get there.
And what's the threshold? Like, what level of accuracy do you actually need to get before you enroll in a project or something?
So right now the threshold is based on a field inventory, which is at a 95% confidence interval. That confidence interval we want to be plus or minus 10% of the mean. So there's this wiggle room of 10% allowable error on a field inventory for carbon that we're kind of aiming for with remote sensing that already exists for a field inventory. Like I said, the only technology that we've really demonstrated can do that is LiDAR, but we think that these other emerging technologies are going to get us there more globally, be more globally available and cheaper too.
How much cheaper is LiDAR actually than like a field inventory? Like if I wanted to check out a forest, how much cheaper would it actually be?
It's really a matter of scale. If we're talking about a single farmer at, 1,000 acres or, however many hectares, it's never going to be cheaper than just sending out a human being. If we're talking about a very large area in which you can acquire this data across many 2,000 little farms, then it's almost always going to be cheaper. You never want to like get an airplane off the ground, fly it 500 miles, scan an area, and then that's very small, and then fly it back. This is where all the money goes. So the other thing that exists is public LiDAR. The U.S. government has flown basically the entire country right now with LiDAR, and so if that can be used, that's a great alternative because it's free because the government does it.
And is that data openly accessible? Like, can anybody access it, or how?
Anybody can access it, and we've created some really cool maps of regional biomass across the entire Northeast, for example, from the public LiDAR data set. It's got these caveats. So, for example, if the LiDAR was flown in 2017, we have to make sure that a forest that we're looking at hasn't been harvested at all in the last 3 years. But it is an available source that we're really interested in. If you want to get more technical on the data science side, we're excited about the current LiDAR, the existing LiDAR because we want to be able to use it to pre-train neural networks, artificial intelligence technologies, to estimate tree height, like this, with the lower resolution stuff. So we envision this scenario in which instead of having to train a model off of field data, which is something we haven't talked about at all. It's a really challenging thing. If you want to train a remote sensing model, you basically need field plots, right? So thousands of field plots potentially in whatever area that you're interested in. We would like to be able to use this as a pre-training device to make the artificial intelligence learn a little bit about the forest initially, and then we can retrain it on field plots, fewer field plots, and potentially get a much more accurate result, even if we're using a technology that's not as good as LiDAR. So that's our goal for the current public LiDAR data set. But
how far along are those machine learning technologies? Like how accurate are they right now, and what's the status?
The immersion technologies, I think the status is getting there. A lot of them cost a lot of money, so we haven't seen as many researchers actually publishing work because of it. Planet data offers Planet, for example, offers stereo imagery, but they don't offer the three-dimensional product, which is a difficult thing to generate from stereo imagery in a consistent manner. And then the only company that I know of that's offering stereo three-dimensional data from space is Airbus, and they charge more than LiDAR for this data. So that's kind of a non-starter. So I do think we're getting there because there's competition coming. A lot, satellites are being launched every day that can measure these things, and the prices are coming down on you can track them by month. They just drop and drop and drop. But I do think a little bit more work is needed to consistently create these three-dimensional renderings that can then be used to estimate forest biomass. We don't know what the European satellite that I talked about, the biomass satellite, is going to provide for us. In 2 years' time, maybe we'll all be using that because it's going to be something like moderate resolution, and it's going to tell us a lot about how much carbon is in the forest using the radar. So I would say that we're kind of on the fringe, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have too much to point to in terms of widespread successes.
A question about field data and sort of the field data that's needed to train machine learning models. So can you speak to sort of the challenges associated with that?
Yeah, so like any big artificial intelligence or machine learning technology, the ground truth data, the actual data that's used to train the model to make estimates is kind of the most important part. We can only use all this fancy remote sensing technology when we have field data to begin with. Field data, what I'm referring to are these manual measurements that are identical to the ones that are made currently in carbon, for carbon projects. But the issue really comes about in that, parts of the world, we don't have any field measurements, Papua New Guinea, for example. So if someone were to fly all of Papua New Guinea with LiDAR or give me stereo images of the entire country, I still couldn't tell you how much biomass there was because there wasn't any field data to actually train the model to begin with. So this is the biggest challenge for Pachama, and it's going to continue to be that. And it's also the biggest challenge for anyone doing this work. If you look at some of these global images that are generated by NASA and whatnot of biomass across the entire globe, if you actually read the details, they're generated off of a couple hundred field plots in South America and a couple hundred field plots in North America. And so most of the error comes not from the remote sensing technology itself, but just from the lack of great field data. And it's not as exciting a thing. This is very exciting stuff, right? You get these beautiful images, and it's new, but it's even more important. And I will say there's a lot of field data out there because governments are requested by the FAO to inventory their forests. And so every single country has a forest inventory, usually consisting of field plots that are placed every 15 to 20 kilometers from one another. But very few countries actually share that data with anybody. So it's hidden. And so nobody in remote sensing, academics or otherwise, can make use of that field data. It's the number one challenge, I would say.
Wow. All right. I mean, okay. Are you okay? One more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, how does that data get acquired then? Like you say, it's the number one challenge. How do we aim towards a solution?
Sending people out into the woods is so, the ultimate solution is to maybe pressure governments to release their field data. The US government doesn't do it. Some countries are public, like Brazil. But what we had to do in Brazil is hire somebody from Brazil to physically go and knock on the government's doors of every state and demand that they release the data in person. This is not a practical solution. Um, so yes, there are a number of initiatives like one by NASA to kind of bring together as much public field data as they can, but also just like maybe political pressure to make these things more publicly available to scientists and private companies like us too, would go a really long way to our ability to measure the forest in general.
Okay, so maybe as a final question here, like what are some good ways for someone interested to learn more about forest remote sensing to sort of kick that off? I mean, I know after this conversation, I'm fascinated and I want to keep learning. So, are there like things to check out or resources, or how would you recommend to take the next step?
Yeah, so there are a couple of great review papers that do a much more coherent job than me of describing like every different type of remote sensing technique. There's a section devoted to radar, there's a section devoted to LiDAR, there's a section devoted to low resolution imaging and high resolution. And so I will definitely link those to you. There are other papers describing the actual approach for going from LiDAR data to forest inventory data that you can use to make all kinds of decisions about the forest, which I will also share with you. And then there are textbooks out there. Remote sensing is the name of a textbook that is pretty comprehensive. It tells you everything you want to know about remote sensing in a much, in a more clearly laid out way. Step by step, the different remote sensing technologies and how they can be applied. With remote sensing, you've always got to think about kind of maybe three different things. You've always got to think about scale. So spaceborne stuff is the largest scale, but the lowest quality. You've always got to think about quality. And then you've always got to think about temporal availability as well. So LiDAR, poor, moderate to poor scale, very high quality, very, can only be flown once. A spaceborne technology is probably like, very high scale, but, moderate quality, but can be acquired on a monthly basis. So there's these trade-offs that kind of have to come into play.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to checking out those papers, and thank you so much, Elias, for being here and for doing this interview.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to help.
All right, cool.